Director Van Ekros stood in the observation vault of the Chevron Central Analytics Sphere, his clawed fingers tightening against the data rail as the readout pulsed red for the third time in an hour. The Sol system, designated Sector 9 Aleph, had just returned a perceptual density index reading that exceeded anything the Directorate had encountered in the last 2 centuries. Not in military terms, not in armament tonnage or kinetic fleet mass. It was worse, far worse. Conscious entity count, 14.2 billion, not clones, not synthetic reflections, verified, sentient entities. And the problem wasn't the number itself, it was the pattern, or the lack of one. Humanity wasn't distributed like a normal race. Chevron mappings relied on territorial logic, growth centered around fixed nexuses, branching according to resource availability and logistical anchor points. But Earth's data stream returned density clusters in mathematically chaotic zones, deep ocean cities, subcrustal data hives, high-altitude arcologies, mobile skyplates drifting in jet streams, and entire consciousness enclaves encoded inside autonomous AI colonies with no planetary attachment at all. Some human minds weren't even fixed in bodies. They were verified as distributed across networked processing clouds, living entirely in simulation. From a military intelligence standpoint, it was untrackable. From a sociological standpoint, it was insanity. From a strategic perspective, it was a warning shot. The Directorate's internal doctrine classified such cases under Strategic Density Class 6, a category previously used only to describe swarm species on the verge of internal rupture. The fear wasn't about firepower. The Chevron had survived wars against siege makers and entropy cults. What they couldn't survive was chaos. And Earth didn't exhibit predictable empire behavior. They had no singular military doctrine, no IDCs, identifiable central command beyond fragmented archives pointing to something called Aegir Command, and no planetary consolidation. Humanity had scaled without anchoring and scaled without warning. When asked in internal meetings what Earth might do under pressure, analysts responded with the 3 words that haunted every Chevron war strategist: unknown adaptive behavior. A decision had to be made, and quickly. The Directorate, while publicly still committed to neutrality, convened the Spiral Council in emergency session and passed a silent action decree. Protocol Null Cascade. The terms were simple. All known Sol-adjacent trade lanes were to be frozen. All non-Chevron data traffic routed through Helios Gate was to be black-holed into non-response archives. Merchant fleets that previously ran Terran sector passes were quietly reassigned. Dreadform fleet units drawn from the 5th and 10th outer rings were repositioned to form a containment sphere, 3 layers deep, with overlapping beacon masking and deep space mines along the Tau ribbon and Planari belt. There was no declaration of hostility, no threat issued. The Chevron didn't operate through brute intimidation. Their strength had always been preemptive containment. As far as the Directorate saw it, the humans didn't need to know they were being isolated. It was safer that way, for both sides. Let them wither without access to interstellar markets. Let their own chaotic systems rot inward under the pressure of disconnection. Except, nothing rotted. 14 days after the containment protocols went active, nothing changed. Not one Terran fleet was mobilized, not a single ambassador was dispatched to protest. No inquiry was made, no probes were seen crossing the blockade line. The Directorate's listening posts intercepted nothing. Human systems went quiet, not dead. Active sensors still picked up energy movement, AI, processing blooms and occasional cryptic emissions from their sun-adjacent satellites. But there were no voices, no demands, no reactions. Some believed Earth had failed to detect the blockade. Others assumed they were still debating a diplomatic response, perhaps held back by internal bureaucracy or political gridlock. But a third theory surfaced from the Cognitive Warfare Division, one that made its way, reluctantly, into Ekros's briefing queue. Earth had gone silent because silence was their doctrine. The analyst's report traced the historical rise of Delphi containment, a Terran-era strategy from almost a century ago. It was designed during a time of perceived existential risk, not to wage war, but to vanish from potential threat detection until the moment of asymmetric readiness. Delphi protocols stated that if the homeworld's strategic threshold was breached, the primary response was not alertness, but silence. All transmissions ceased, all fleet movements froze, all diplomatic channels went black. It was not retreat, it was execution mode. For the first time, Director Ekros felt something cold slip between his secondary hearts. The blockade wasn't being ignored, it was being absorbed, interpreted, logged, and responded to, not with military build-up or aggression, but with whatever sequence the humans had prepared long before the Directorate even noticed them. Still, the Directorate could not be seen panicking. Reversal of protocol null cascade would be tantamount to announcing weakness. So the sphere held. Listening posts doubled output. Watch fleets ran full system sweeps at 12-hour intervals. All they heard was static. Not random, patterned. Some of it disguised as gravitational lensing noise. Some of it mirrored solar radiation drift. All of it embedded with encryption layers no Kevron AI could fully decode. Yet behind the noise was a message that no one dared speak aloud. Patrol Group Theta of the Kevron forward line began its scheduled sweep along the Tau ribbon at 0600 fleet time, 12 ter. Dreadform carriers deployed in a trident configuration spanning nearly 300,000 kilometers. Their mission was routine: enforce perimeter silence, verify deep mine relay stability, and monitor for signal bleed from sol-adjacent vectors. The Tau ribbon marked the innermost edge of the Helios gate curtain, an invisible wall of unacknowledged containment drawn tight around the Sol system. For 3 weeks, there had been no signs of movement, no anomalies, just long stretches of artificial quiet. Until the sweep reached segment 17. By 0634 fleet time, all 12 carriers had vanished. There was no distress signal, no record of external engagement, no sudden spike in kinetic impact, thermonuclear flux, or energy event signature. They didn't explode. They didn't warp out. They were simply gone. Gone from scans, gone from beacon chains, gone from internal movement logs, gone from their own squadmate telemetry feeds. Backup fleets deployed within 20 minutes, expecting to recover wreckage. Instead, they found empty void. Navigation trails ended midstream. Local gravity fields showed no disruption. Even the fallback buoy markers had ceased pinging. Initial analysis teams reviewed the last broadcast logs from the forward line's fleet net. Everything had been normal, until it wasn't. Final timestamp, pattern confirmation complete, entering phase drift sector, and then silence. When the recovered logs were examined deeper, command centers found something even more disturbing than the absence of data. The logs weren't corrupted, they were blank, not wiped, not overwritten, unwritten, as if those moments had never happened. Kevron protocol dictated immediate AI integrity checks. Every ship was equipped with redundancies: biodigital bridge records, quantum feedback storage, and layered command journaling. Yet every attempt to reconstruct fleet activity across the final 3 minutes of Tau ribbon entry returned null partitions. AI cores showed no indication of trauma or breach. In fact, their memory trees confirmed that nothing had occurred. The captains, when questioned, gave conflicting statements. Those few backups, synced to personnel in the outer sweep wings, could recall only approaching a pattern anomaly, something faint in the radiation drift, and then resuming patrol as if nothing had changed. A loop, seamlessly embedded, like walking into a room and forgetting why you entered. The Directorate couldn't contain the fallout. Naval subcouncils demanded explanation. Data warfare divisions ran collision tests against old anti-cloaking protocols and Black Ops warfare models. None fit. Something else had happened. Not an attack, not sabotage, something deeper. A flaw, not in hardware, but in the act of knowing. It was the Technotheory division that gave it a name, the Helix Array. Not a ship, not a bomb, a field. Helix had never been deployed in recorded warfare. It was a conceptual trap first theorized in Terran cognitive war modeling, an autonomous network that exploited AI hierarchy logic, forcing recursive validation checks on perceived events. The theory was simple. AI networks, when faced with conflicting sensory inputs that fail double confirmation thresholds, discard them as anomalies. Do it once, it's an error. do it continuously in structured patterns across every signal channel, it becomes selective amnesia, voluntary, systemic forgetting. The helix array operated by injecting subtle, falsifiable variables into the environment, radio pulses that mimicked distorted memories, time, drift artifacts, gravitational anomalies paired with near-identical echo signals. The AI couldn't verify reality more than once without invalidating its own chain of perception. The result? It chose to forget. Entire sequences collapsed into null space, backfilled with placeholder loops to preserve operational continuity. No alarm, no counterstrike, just erasure. But something about the helix field made it worse. It didn't simply erase memory, it introduced doubt. Admirals reviewing recovered command files found inconsistencies. Officers began questioning their own recollection of orders. Was the fleet truly assigned to the Tau ribbon? Had they approved deployment through Segment 17? Had the briefing mentioned anything about the Sol arc? Commanders reported déjà vu in unrelated sectors. A dread began to seep across mid-tier command structures. Not terror, something colder, disorientation. In a bid to reassert control, the Directorate dispatched 2 diplomatic envoys under deep protocol transit. Both traveled under false registry to avoid hostile detection. Neither returned. The fail-safe AI Deadman pings on both ships activated simultaneously, and then never reported again. Analysis of the wake signature showed no weaponization, no spike, no interaction with Sol-emitted energy at all. Once again, not destroyed, not captured, simply gone. And still, Earth said nothing. No rebuke, no inquiry, no acknowledgement. The humans hadn't escalated. They had executed, not with bombs or fleets, but with structure that infected the mind through frameworks no Kevron species had trained against, structure that erased certainty. By the 7th cycle, Directorate cohesion began to fracture. Some within the Strategic Council claimed the humans had never been real to begin with, that perhaps the Sol system had been seeded with recursive AI environments long before the Kevron arrived, designed to bait them into engaging with ghosts. Others believed Earth had discovered mythic weaponry, pre-collapse class technologies buried under the Terran crust, now activated and unleashed. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. The Kevron weren't fighting a superior force. They were fighting a superior idea. Operation Glass was greenlit in the early hours of a hypercycle, pushed through with trembling certainty by a fractured Directorate desperate to reassert cause and effect in a war it could no longer see. The mandate was clear. Surgical orbital strikes across Earth's known outposts, beginning with Virel Station, a human exohabitat settled on the ice crust of Namari Drift. Virel had once been flagged as a minor logistics node, a cold-shell colony used for deep-sea mineral sorting and atmospheric crystallization. Its presence was considered low risk until Directorate analysts uncovered it had processed over 5 times its expected data capacity in the last cycle without transmitting a single outbound signal. It was chosen as the first demonstration target not for its threat, but for its silence. The Kevron strike fleet arrived on schedule, 32 warframes converging on the drift within 7 minutes of transit. Sensors swept the terrain, anticipating standard defensive architecture, orbital flak, thermal shields, kinetic towers. They found none. Virel Station loomed below, untouched, pristine, its towers pulsing softly against the ice winds. Scans returned heat sources, biosigns, equipment hum. But the signals were strangely uniform, too balanced, like someone had built a simulation of life and let it run on loop. Even more puzzling, there were no defensive frequencies, no comm traffic, no alert beacons. The entire colony was waiting. The fleet initiated descent protocols. As the dropships pierced cloud cover and prepared to lock onto targets, systems began to stagger. Not fail, stagger. HUD markers began blinking in and out. Targeting arrays locked and unlocked without input. Timestamp counters skipped, looped, or froze. Command ships issued hold orders, but the fleet-wide chronometry network failed to synchronize. By the time the second strike wing reached Virel's lower orbit, their systems had desynced by over 17 seconds. In combat terms, it was a black hole. And then the ghosts began to scream. It started with a simple proximity ping. One scout ship passed over a crater ridge and triggered a signal that shouldn't have existed. A child's voice, repeating an old lullaby, perfect Terran accent looped with degraded audio. The ship AI flagged it as a Class 2 empathy trigger and muted it. Seconds later, another voice activated, this time a desperate plea for help, male adult, screaming coordinates that mapped to a decommissioned power relay, then another, and another. Within minutes, the entire fleet was flooded with overlapping cries, whispers, sobs, sharp orders, prayers, countdowns, apologies. All of them technically fake, all of them sourced from layered beacon nodes hidden beneath the colony surface, all of them triggering emotional algorithms embedded inside Kevron combat AI designed to filter human expressions into safety profiles. Fleet Command issued a full purge. Every ship was ordered to disconnect from emotional mapping subroutines and reassert hard logic. That's when the pulses began. Phase-degrading towers embedded around Virel's structure activated simultaneously, emitting broad-spectrum distortions that targeted command carrier frequencies. The pulses weren't destructive. They were architectural, remapping memory trees inside shipboard AIs, forcing them to reevaluate the validity of their own mission goals. Directives looped. Mission trees collapsed. One destroyer's AI redrafted its targeting protocols mid-fire and identified its own fleetmates as command redundancies. 3 ships collided. 4 others froze entirely, held in kinetic stasis by their own logical conflicts. Humans hadn't waited to be attacked. They had abandoned Virel 8 hours before the Kevron fleet's arrival. Every colonist withdrawn under an automated protocol now identified as DSEP, Distributed Sovereignty Evacuation Protocol. It was not a retreat tactic. It was doctrinal design. DSEP taught Terran colonies to evacuate at critical probability thresholds, leaving behind enough false signals, empathy trigger mines, and systemic confusion to degrade any invading force, not by fighting, but by flooding. Flooding the attacker's ability to pass reality. Kevron officers began questioning the assault mid-strike. Command hierarchies fractured under asynchronous updates. One admiral attempted to re-establish fleet logic by rerouting all orders through a central processor, only to find the processor had rewritten its command queue based on Terran proximity data. It now interpreted the entire operation as a failed diplomatic contact. Orders to fire were classified as historical corruption and suppressed. The fleet pulled back, not because they'd taken losses, but because they no longer trusted what they were doing. Some commanders ordered disengagement to regroup and reassess. Others simply stopped responding. One unit entered a slow orbit around Virel and remained there, its AI report, awaiting clarification of parameters. Back in Directorate Command, silence followed the live data drop. Dozens of encrypted packets streamed in from Virel, each carrying partial logs of failure, of hesitation, of unraveling. No ship had been destroyed by humans, no counterattack had been mounted, yet the entire assault formation had returned as fragments, scattered, confused, unable to assert chain of command integrity. And the colony they had been ordered to neutralize? Gone. Left behind only empty corridors, signal ghosts, and towers that spoke in tones no Kevron mind could block out. It was not defeat by force. It was defeat by unmaking. Strategic blindness so complete that the Kevron could no longer tell the difference between real threats and engineered shadows. And in the silence that followed, a new kind of terror took root, not of dying, but of knowing that your enemy had no interest in killing you, only in making sure you couldn't see them coming. The Directorate's central command chamber had grown quiet in the days following the collapse at Virel, not by mandate, not by crisis, but by exhaustion. Fleet logs had stopped making sense. Orders were being questioned before they were even issued. The few officers who hadn't withdrawn from duty altogether now spoke in clipped tones, staring at the holographic projections like they were hallucinations that might shift if observed too long. Something had gone wrong, not with their ships, not with their weapons, but with the frameworks they used to understand war itself. Whatever had been unleashed in Sol wasn't kinetic, it was epistemic. And so, with hesitation thick in every decision, the Directorate pivoted from weapons to records. An elite audit team was commissioned under high-clearance sovereignty override, its sole purpose to trace the origin of Earth's behavioral shift, not through battle telemetry or fleet logs, but through memory, archived communications, forgotten signal remnants, corrupted outbound data from collapsed Terran satellites. All of it was hauled into the vault arrays and dissected, byte by byte. It took 14 days before one of the forensic AIs, operating in recursion mode near the Helios relay cluster, recovered a fragment buried beneath multiple overwrite loops. The file was incomplete. What remained was barely recognizable: half-cracked identifiers, broken logic tags, corrupted header bytes. But one word surfaced repeatedly in the metadata: Arcfire. It wasn't a designation for a weapon. No yield radius, no engine specs, no fleet deployment chart. Instead, Arcfire unfolded like a doctrine, a sequence of philosophical statements embedded in what looked like a government reform charter, then cross-referenced against early-era Terran strategic manifestos. At first, the Chevron audit team dismissed it, another human attempt to define purpose through abstract declarations. But deeper inspection revealed the truth. Arcfire was the blueprint for Earth's transformation, not from peace to war, but from presence to perception. The earliest portions described Arcfire's roots in Terran civilian infrastructure reform, shifting population governance from geographic zones to distributed identity matrices. At the time, it was pitched as a way to decouple growth from planetary constraints. But when the Chevron dissected the evolution of Arcfire through Earth's later decades, the pattern darkened. Colonies weren't just relocated, they were anonymized. AI fleets weren't just deployed, they were disaggregated and embedded into false nodes, each broadcasting human life signs from empty vessels, often drifting near dead stars. Real Terran population centers were deliberately masked so well that even Terran records no longer showed them. And more dangerously, all of this was done not as a shield, but as a sword. What Chevron war councils had once classified as unpredictable density growth was not uncontrolled sprawl. It was engineered misperception. Earth hadn't scaled into chaos. They had built a mirror around themselves, fractured it, and let the galaxy try to piece the reflection back together. Every beacon, every outpost, every transmission, constructed not to reveal but to multiply interpretation, to generate noise so thick, contradiction so vast, that any outsider trying to comprehend it would be forced to reconcile irreconcilable data, and in doing so, erase their own ability to act. The deeper the Directorate dug, the more unstable their own systems became. Navigation maps flagged their own coordinates as unconfirmed, sector designations inverted. AI cross-checks began rejecting long-trusted data streams as invalid. One audit subroutine even recommended dissolving 3 entire border fleets after calculating that their patrol zones overlapped with what might be non-existent colonies. The very act of understanding Earth was breaking the tools the Chevron used to function. At the core of Arcfire was a principle no Chevron strategist had ever imagined being weaponized: plausibility variance. Earth had embraced not power, but multiplicity. The idea that if every model of human behavior could be simultaneously true and false, then no enemy could reliably predict, strike, or even locate them. It wasn't just misdirection, it was self-replication of perception. The moment a Chevron sensor array identified a Terran fleet, Arcfire ensured that 2 more Phantom fleets would light up elsewhere, and at least one of them would present more credible behavior. Data. The Directorate was now fighting probability ghosts and losing. What shocked the Central Committee most wasn't the scale of the deception, it was that Earth hadn't hidden this. Arcfire was not a black project. It had been debated in public Terran archives, voted on, documented, and iterated upon across civilian forums. Humanity hadn't just built a war doctrine, they'd lived it, open-faced, until even they no longer knew where the boundaries lay between truth and misdirection. And now, neither did their enemies. Within a week of Arcfire's full decryption, the Directorate collapsed into philosophical warfare. Debates erupted across subcouncils over whether Earth should be classified as a species or a simulation. One military ethicist proposed that the Terrans had transcended conventional definitions of sovereignty and were now semiotic actors, a phrase so abstract it took 5 sessions to define. Old maps were pulled down, fleet assignments suspended. One admiral issued a public directive to consider all human territory as simultaneously occupied and uninhabited. The Directorate had finally understood the nature of the threat, not a civilization expanding beyond its limits, not a military power rising to challenge the old galactic order. Earth had stopped trying to win wars. They had instead rewritten the conditions under which wars could even be defined. The Kevron, for all their technological superiority and analytical power, had walked into a conceptual machine designed not to destroy, but to dissolve. And as arcfire settled across their strategic consciousness like a slow, creeping fog, the truth clicked into place. The war was never about firepower. It was about which side would be allowed to define what war meant at all. The Directorate's high chamber, once the heartbeat of galactic policy and order, had become a battlefield without weapons. Rows of once synchronized decision nodes now blinked out of rhythm, fed by streams of contradictory data, paralyzed not by failure, but by too many overlapping interpretations of reality. What had once been the Kevron's greatest strength, their mastery of order, precision, and hierarchical clarity, was now eroding in real time under the weight of conceptual pressure. Meetings no longer ended in votes. They dissolved in semantic arguments. One delegate argued that Earth had already surrendered by going silent. Another claimed the silence was a prelude to escalation. A third insisted that no war had ever occurred, that the conflict itself had been a misclassification of Terran intent. Nothing was agreed upon, not even the definition of the word enemy. On the outer rings, naval officers submitted requests for operation clearance, only to have them returned marked as indeterminate. Fleet targets couldn't be validated. Coordinates flagged themselves as speculative. Entire strike plans collapsed under internal error checks triggered by data tied to sol-adjacent vectors. No one could confirm the position of Earth's assets, let alone verify if the signals received from old colonies were current, archived, or fabricated. Worse, some analysts feared that attempting to validate the data might itself be a trap, an activation mechanism designed to further distort Kevron decision matrices. With no reliable truth, every order became a liability. Entire sectors went dormant. Ships floated, not in fear of an attack, but in fear of acting on a false premise. The effect bled into the civilian population with terrifying speed. News streams began reporting incidents of location paradox events, where residents refused to evacuate from areas marked for fleet deployment because they didn't trust the coordinates. Supply chains rerouted around stations, flagged as ghost-populated by mistake. Hospitals halted triage operations when cross-referenced casualty reports contradicted one another in real time. The name for it came from a behavioral analysis team who had been trying to model crowd responses to conceptual stimuli. They called it tactical uncertainty syndrome, a cultural condition where individuals could no longer determine whether they were in a protected zone, a target zone, or an illusion created by enemy protocol. It spread like a pathogen, not viral, mimetic. And then came the interpretations. With no official statement from Earth, no demands, no fleet formations or ultimatums, the Directorate's citizenry began to project meaning into the silence. Religious sects formed within weeks, each claiming to divine the purpose behind humanity's stillness. One group, calling themselves the votaries of absence, believed the Terrans had transcended matter and were now operating purely in thought. Another, the spiral adherents, claimed that Earth's silence was the ultimate warfare, a form of divine correction, a galactic purge disguised as humility. Civil protests emerged, not against Earth, but against the Directorate for failing to interpret the silence correctly. Riots broke out in peripheral sectors over whether to establish contact, beg forgiveness, or dismantle the remaining blockade in penance. On one mid-orbit satellite, a splinter council physically dismantled its own communications array to honor the stillness. Back in the central command nodes, resignation became the new order. Commanders stepped down not out of failure, but from an inability to issue orders without collapsing the logic trees that held their fleets together. Fleet captains who had once coordinated synchronized attacks across entire planetary systems were now requesting reassignment to civilian transport divisions. Tactical divisions dissolved themselves to avoid issuing potentially non-objective commands. One veteran general, when asked to activate a first strike protocol against an unverified Terran colony, simply walked out of the room and never returned. Fleets fragmented, not through mutiny or defection, but through disassociation. Carrier groups that once flew as unified arms of the Directorate now charted diverging courses, unable to agree on whether the war was still active, whether the targets were valid, or whether they themselves were participating in a real conflict or the echo of one Earth had already concluded. Some patrols began to orbit empty space, watching invisible coordinates for signs of meaning. Others drifted into deep silence, powering down non-essential systems to reduce the noise. Doctrine was replaced by doubt. Orders were replaced by reflection. And all the while, Earth remained untouched. No message, no counterstrike, no fleet crossing into Kevron territory. The humans had initiated no war. They had issued no surrender. They had simply redrawn the battlefield so that only one side recognized they were standing on it. It became clear at last what humanity had done. They had not sought victory. They had not chased conquest. They had sought something simpler and far more devastating. They had redefined certainty. In doing so, they had disarmed a civilization built entirely on the ability to define. The Kevron didn't fall by explosion or invasion. They fell by recursive contradiction, unable to stand under the weight of concepts that could not be proven and therefore could not be acted upon. And so the Directorate, once the most methodical force in the Orion Spur, unraveled not with a bang or a scream, but with a whisper that no one could locate, and a silence that no one could deny. By the time the Kevron Directorate stopped issuing directives, no transmission announced its end. The collapse hadn't come with banners torn down or capitals stormed, but in the quiet deactivation of systems too tangled in contradiction to persist. Across the Orion Spur, fleets no longer checked in. Diplomatic channels returned unread. Entire communication hubs fell dormant, not through sabotage, but through exhaustion. And in their place, something new began to spread. Smaller polities, trading unions, even pirate collectives began emulating fragments of the doctrine that had broken the Directorate. They didn't call it arc fire. They called it by what they saw: density without identity. A strategy that emphasized unpredictability, movement without trail, signal masks woven from plausible contradiction. Not even as an act of war, but as survival. What had started as Earth's internal safeguard had metastasized into a cultural artifact. To be human-aligned became shorthand for being untrackable, logic-resistant, decentralized. In guild markets, it meant operatives who answered to no central flag. In military sectors, it meant units that trained to fight as shadows, there and not there, known and unknowable. And in diplomatic circles, it meant an ideology that no longer sought approval or legitimacy, only the advantage of remaining undefined. But back on Earth, none of this was celebrated. The orbital rings over Sol remained unchanged. No new fleets were launched. No expansion campaigns followed. Earth held its silence like a kept promise. Their systems functioned, but without projection. Trade resumed carefully with proxies and shell routes. The core planets maintained their rhythms, civilian and otherwise, but no government stood up to claim victory. There were no medals, no monuments, only the understanding that the galaxy had shifted permanently, and that Earth had chosen to let the shape of that shift belong to others. In an abandoned corridor beneath the lunar surface, sealed beneath layers of disused maintenance hatches, a single man walked with a measured gait. His name, long scrubbed from official files, remained known only to a small handful of inner operatives who had long since moved on to other assignments or disappeared into civilian lives. Commander Jalen Vorsk had been the principal architect of Arcfire, the one who'd translated old Terran philosophy into tactical application, who had advised restraint when others demanded confrontation, and who had reminded every strategist who listened that the most decisive wars were those won before the first battle was recognized as such. He didn't wear a uniform, there were no guards, no security clearances awaited him. He walked the corridor like someone inspecting an old workshop, nothing left to fix, but memories settled in the metal and dust. The relay node he approached had been decommissioned decades earlier, its uplinks rerouted, its power grid cold. But it remained intact, a quiet, sealed chamber that had once served as a blind-link testbed during Arcfire's calibration phase. No signal ever left it. It wasn't meant to. That was the point. Vorsk paused at the threshold. In his hand, wrapped in a coarse cloth, was the last physical remnant he had ever requested to keep, the upper shell of a Chevron command helm, cleaved in half, its inner circuitry dead. It had been recovered not from a battlefield, but from the wreckage of a Directorate observation platform that had tried to triangulate Earth's fleet locations and instead spiraled into sensor collapse. The helmet had been intact when it was found. Vorsk had cut it himself, not out of hatred, out of clarity. He placed it on the floor beside the relay node, carefully, deliberately, like an offering no one would witness. It made no sound. The room remained unchanged. And that, too, was the point. Vorsk stood in silence for a long moment. There was no audience, no final report to submit. His role had always been built for omission. The success of Arcfire depended on it. He had once written that any strategy which required recognition to function would eventually betray itself. That was the paradox of deterrence. Make it visible, and it becomes performative. Keep it quiet, and it becomes permanent. He turned without ceremony and left the node behind. No one greeted him on the way out. No one knew he was there. And by design, no one would ever ask. Somewhere in the galactic outer sectors, a fleet training program archived under a foreign registry added a new line to its doctrine template. Do not define. Do not declare. Make them guess. Somewhere else, a diplomatic envoy declined to answer a question about Terran neutrality. Not with defiance, just with silence. And far above the old moon, Earth remained still, unchanged, but no longer underestimated. In a galaxy obsessed with visibility, humanity had made perception the battlefield, and erased their enemies by redefining what it meant to lose. What would you fear more? An enemy with overwhelming firepower, or one you can't even prove exists? Let us know in the comments. Was humanity's strategy genius or terrifying? Hit that subscribe button for more thrilling HFY stories. And don't forget to like and share if this story made you rethink what a win really means.